Now, the plant that you want to harvest doesn't actually grow at this time of year. It isn't even out of the ground, but it likes to grow in the second wettest spots. So by seeing how the snow melts and using indicator plants, plants that are there before the plant you want, you can locate the populations or stands of the plant that you may want. And you only see like 50 feet and there's more plants over your head. More plants over your head. Um, if you had come to the meadow at this time, for the first time, you wouldn't be able to really see the meadow still because there's shrubs and other plants. Finding the plants you want to harvest would be like finding a needle in a haystack. But you were there in the spring, so you know where to go. There's a possibility, a good possibility that the plants you want are in those second wettest spots that melted first. Hi, I'm Howie Brownstein, and I've been teaching at the Columbines School of Botanical Studies. That's my school. This is going to be the 37th annual Spring Apprenticeship Program. And I wanted to talk about how we teach locating, propagating, and tending populations of plants in the wild. So let's say that the plant that you wanted to harvest grows in a middle elevation, mucky, marshy mountain meadow. Alliteration is the spice of life, you know, where all the letters start off with the same, all the words start off with the same letters. Mucky, marshy, middle elevation meadow. These meadows are very difficult to work with. They're hard to get in and out of. They're hard to walk around because, and they're hard to locate because they're completely surrounded by a thick layer of trees and shrubs that lose their leaves in the winter. For example, alders and willows. So the whole outside of these middle elevation meadows are full of alders and willows. The way to work with this is to go there in the spring, to go there in the early spring when it's covered with snow. And people say to me, Howie, what are you going to see? You're just going to see a field of snow. And that's true. But the object is to get there when the snow is melting. Because for those of you that live in the snow, you know that if everything is the same slope and the same sunlight and the same soil contents, then the wetter spots melt first. And that's what you're there to see. Because when you get there, you see the field of snow and all the non-forested area is under snow. All those willows and alders are under snow. The shrub layer is under snow, but around that snow is the forest. So you can see the total non-forested area. At this point, the wettest spots melt first, so the creek that runs through the meadow is melted. That's right, you could be walking on like 5 feet of snow, but the creek is melted. That's the wettest spots. And on either side, the second wettest spots, those have melted and there's plants blooming. The first plants are already blooming. And as you walk around the meadow, you'll find other spots that are the second wettest spots, the same amount of moisture. And they'll be melted and they'll have blooming plants. Now, the plant that you want to harvest doesn't actually grow at this time of year. It isn't even out of the ground, but it likes to grow in the second wettest spots. So by seeing how the snow melts and using indicator plants, plants that are there before the plant you want, you can locate the populations or stands of the plant that you may want. While you're there, it's a beautiful time to be there. Most people don't go there when the snow's melting. So if you look around, that would be the good time, for example, to, let's say that your area has a threatened plant. Let's say it's a threatened orchid that only grows in your one county and it only grows right after the melting snow. Now, I'm making this up. There are threatened orchids, and there are threatened plants that aren't orchids, and there are plenty of plants that only grow in one county, and there's plenty of plants that grow just after the retreating snow. But I'm just, for example, we'll say that there's a threatened orchid, one that blooms just after snow melt, and then within a week or two, it dries out completely and follows the retreating snow only in these meadows. So you've been looking for that plant for a while, maybe even years, and you walk around and you find it. You find the threatened orchid growing in the back left-hand side of the meadow. So this is great. That makes your day. So off you go, you're on your way out, and you come across a herd of elk that run off. And the elk have these little babies this time of year, so it makes for a wonderful vision. And off they go, and their tracks are very easy to see, right? They're easy to see because it's snow. So you follow the snow, you follow the tracks out of the meadow, follow the elk trails out of the meadow. On your way out, you come across a elk poop. but it's not normal elk poop, it's runny elk poop, it's elk diarrhea. Now, if it was class, I would gather everyone around and say, let's look at this runny elk poop. And someone would say, come on, Howie, what does this have to do with plants? Well, it has a lot to do with plants because everything's interconnected. The elk have been living on, they've been living on bark all winter long. They've been living on a restricted diet. And now that the first plants have come up, the second wettest spots, they're gorging out on greens. So they get like elk diarrhea. They get essentially a spring cleanse. They'll have a few weeks for their bodies to adjust to this new green food. So this means a lot to us as plant locators because we could be walking through the woods. You could be walking through the woods, the snow on the ground, the snow's melting, and in the woods it's still dark, no real plant, no blooming flowers yet, and you're walking around and you come across runny elk poop. That means that the sunny spots and the wet spots that are just right, the first flushes of plants have come up and the elk have started eating, and it's the perfect time to do this type of locating. So off you go, and then you come back again in the late spring, early summer, and it's completely different. When you get to the meadow, you don't see the meadow, you see the alders or willows, you see these shrubs, tree-like shrubs that are over your head that are really thick. You can barely walk through them. And down underneath on the ground, it's mucky and wet. There's skunk cabbage blooming or stuff like that. There's skunk cabbage. It may not be blooming then. You look around and there's like skunk cabbage underneath, and it's really thick. There seems to be no trails. If you walk into it, you could just be walking in circles as soon as you walk away from the open spots. And you can't see into it. You don't know if there's a meadow in there. You don't know if it's all shrubs. You don't know if there's a lake in there. Even to walk around it to see how big it is can be really tricky because it isn't like here's the forest and here's the shrub layer. As you get close to the shrub layer, it intermixes with the forest and it gets hard to walk. It's hard to walk around. So it's very easy to not be able, it's very hard to simply walk around it. It's very hard to simply walk around it because there may not be a clear edge. Well, you have this vision of the spring because you were there, so you know there's a meadow in there. You know there's second wettest spots. And we would teach you a number of ways to get in and out of, we'll teach you a number of ways of getting in and out of the shrub layer. One of the ways is animal trails, deer and elk trails, which could be easy to see this time of year or difficult. So, but you know, because you were there in the spring, you know where the elk trails are. You tracked them when they were in the snow. So you go back to that same spot and you look. You might have to get really tall and you have to get down on your knees and you got to look from this angle, you got to look from that angle, and you'll hit just the right angle and you see where the animals slip through the shrub layer. So you go through that shrub layer and you get into the meadow and it's completely different. There's shrubs behind you, there's shrubs on either side of you, and in front of you is knee-high grass. Well, it isn't really grasses, it's sedges. There are sedges, but we'll call them grasses for now. And you only see like 50 feet and there's more plants over your head. More plants over your head. If you had come to the meadow at this time, for the first time, you wouldn't be able to really see the meadow still because there's shrubs and other plants. Finding the plants you want to harvest would be like finding a needle in a haystack. And we will teach you how to find a needle in a haystack. But you were there in the spring, so you know where to go. There's a possibility, a good possibility that the plants you want are in those second wettest spots that melted first. So off you go, looking around, and you find the plant. You find the plants you want. You find a lot of them. You find 30,000 of them. You find 30,000 plants, and all you need is 20 roots for your friends and family for the year, for medicine, for friends and family for the year. So this is great. You look around, you check out the populations, you see that it's blooming, it's a beautiful day, the plants are healthy. I mean, this is perfect, right? This is perfect. It's a beautiful sunny day with some clouds and it's warm, so maybe you want to take your picnic and then go down by the creek and get in or get your feet in. This is one of those times that you're glad to be out, which is like most times. Anyway, off you go. You leave the meadow because you're not gonna harvest today. You're going to wait till fall. And so as you're leaving the meadow, you think to yourself, what can I do to help this stand? What can I do to help this population to make it grow better? And it's interesting because some plants, if you pick them, you kill them. Some plants, if you pick the flowers, you'll hurt them. Some plants, if you pick the flowers, they'll keep putting up flowers. And the more you pick the flowers, the more there are flowers there will be until the plant freezes. Some plants, you can literally mow them down like with a lawnmower. Just like get in there and cut them all down, or mess up the soil around them, and they'll get thicker and grow better. Those plants that like disturbance, we have found evolved with disturbance. So these types of plants might be evolved with fire, so that when they get burnt down, they grow back thicker and are reinvigorated. Or it may be because they're eaten by deer and elk, by animals. So an animal will graze on this plant. The animal will graze on the plant, eat it down to stubble, eat all the tops. The plant will go into root growth for a while, put out more roots, and then put out a larger patch of plants. And then there's the animals to eat those, and so there's more food for the animals. And so the browser and the plant evolved together to form this relationship, right? Most of you know that the environment is going down the toilet. Leaky radioactive power plant in Japan, poisoning the oceans. We've got the Gulf Coast is covered in oil. I come from New Jersey, and New Jersey is a toxic waste dump. And then now we have this global warming, climate change that's overlaid on everything, and so it all seems to be unraveling. And we're actually pretty lucky in the Pacific Northwest. Like everywhere else, our tapestry of life is frayed at the edges. There's all these loose threads. It's starting to fall apart, but it's intact enough. It's still intact enough that we find that if a plant has evolved with disturbance, it's evolved being eaten by a browser, that browser is still there, at least here in the Pacific Northwest. And so when you look in the meadow, you see that herd of elk that you saw in the spring is actually in that meadow right now. And it's eating those plants that you want. The elk are there eating the plants that you're taking care of. They're actually tending your stand for you. It's going to make more root growth, and the roots will be thicker and stronger for the fall. But wait a second. Are they tending your stand, or are you tending their stand? And this is where things get kind of blurry and definitely worth some thought. So off you go, and you come back in the fall. But you blew it. You come back in the fall and you blew it. You came back a few weeks too late. You showed up with a friend, you get to the meadow, and the plants that you want have gone away. They've gone back to dormancy for the winter. Most of them have already shriveled up, and the top parts are gone, and you can't even find them. You go all the way through the meadow and you find 50 plants. You get ready to harvest 20 roots, and your friend's like, you can't harvest 20 roots out of 50 plants. You're going to destroy the stand. And that's true. If you had shown up at this time, there's no way you could ethically harvest, reasonably harvest, and have the population continue. But you have that year-round vision. You were there in the summer, late spring, early summer. You saw that there's really 30,000 plants, and that most of these plants are just asleep for the year in their dormant stage. So you're really picking less than 1%, very small amount. Another thing is that these plants seem unhealthy. They're brown, they're bug-eaten, they're falling over, they look like they're dying. You're going to pick unhealthy plants? How healthy are they? Some people would say you dig up the plant and look at the root and you can see if the root's healthy. I consider that a little invasive. I don't like to do that. The concept of like digging up the plant and saying, oh, these roots are unhealthy, I better not dig them up, and putting them back. But you have that year-round vision. You saw it when it was in full bloom. You know the plants are as healthy as can be, and that this is a good stand. And what about that threatened orchid? You can't even see it. You can't see one shriveled up leaf or stem. There's no indication whatsoever that threatened orchid is growing there this time of year. But with your year-round vision, you know not to go back to the back left-hand side of the meadow and harvest. You can skip those plants to protect the threatened orchid. So this is how we look at harvesting. We actually use many more factors than the ones I've mentioned. This is just an example. We look at things like, have other people been picking here? What happened to the land? What was going on with this land, and who was taking care of it before it was public lands? What is your relationship to the plants and to society, and how does the plant grow, and what pollinates it, and what other plants grow with it, things like that. These are important questions, and we do have our wildcrafting checklist that we would go over for every plant. I'll put a link in the description in case you're interested. But this is a good example of a number of factors that we use. So you go ahead and harvest. You go ahead and dig up the roots. You know this plant likes disturbance, so you can take parts of the root clumps and put them back into the ground. Maybe leave the soil from the clump that you have, like shake off the soil. The soil is very important. The soil is more precious than the plant itself for the ecosystem. So you go ahead and replant the plant, and you give it some water, and hopefully what you left will grow right back because it likes the disturbance. And you go ahead and start to leave. You give your thanks, and you go home to make medicine for your friends and family for the year. But you're definitely not done. You're still not done. There's that big question: what effect did your harvest have on the stand? And there's only one real way to know that. You have to go back and look yourself. This is how people really learn how to wildcraft. You might have someone teach you, but ultimately you need to go back and see what kind of effect your harvest has and how you might change it to improve your effects. So when you go back, you can't just go back once, because the meadow has these different faces. So you should go back as the snow's melting. You should go back again in the late spring, early summer when things are flowering, and again in the fall, whether you harvest or not, and see, did your replants take? Is there any visible impact that you did by harvesting? Did you change where the elk trails go? I mean, the elk are there in the meadow for a place to hide, and a place to eat, and a place to drink. So they're eating these plants you're harvesting. So if you took a bunch of plants from one corner or something, did you change where the trails go? And if you did change where the trails go, what kind of impact does that have? You may not be able to answer these questions, but this is the job, to go and ask the questions and to figure these questions out. So this is how we teach locating, tending, and propagating stands of populations of plants here at the Columbines School of Botanical Studies. We still have room in this class coming up starting in April. If you're interested, look at the links at the bottom. Thank you for your time. And this wasn't a specific plant. This was a composite of a bunch of different plants, an imaginary plant that shows the examples of things that we do.
Bye. Don't forget to go to the woods.